She was standing in the back of the church hall with a plate of biscuits she'd baked herself when Harlan Voss walked in and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Who let the washwoman sit at the council table?" The room went quiet the way rooms do when something ugly gets said in a place that's supposed to be decent. Nettie Caldwell didn't flinch. She set the plate down on the edge of the long table, smoothed the front of her blue cotton dress, the one with the small tear at the left cuff she hadn't had time to mend, and looked at Harlan Voss the way her mother had taught her to look at men who thought volume was the same thing as authority. Steady. Patient. Like she had all the time in the world and he had very little. "I sit where the sheriff invited me to sit," she said. "If you've got a complaint, take it up with him." Sheriff Boyd McCready was already on his feet. He was a quiet man in the way that deep rivers are quiet. Not because nothing is moving, but because the current is so strong it doesn't need to make noise. He pulled out the chair next to him, the one at the head of the table's right side, and nodded at Nettie. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "thank you for coming." Harlan Voss's jaw tightened, but he sat down. Nettie had grown up on the eastern edge of Solace Creek, in a house her father built with timber he'd cut himself from the ridge above the Callaway River. Her father, James Caldwell, had been a surveyor, a man who spent his life measuring things precisely, who believed that the truth of any piece of land was in its numbers, its lines, its legal description. He died when Nettie was 19, leaving her that house, 40 acres, and a leather satchel full of survey maps she hadn't opened in 3 years. She was 26 now. She'd been managing the land alone since then, leasing the east pasture to a neighbor for grazing, keeping a kitchen garden that fed her through winter, taking in seamstress work from the women in town who had more money than time. She wasn't wealthy. Everyone in Solace Creek knew she wasn't wealthy. But the land was hers, paid and recorded, and she'd never been late on a tax payment in her life. What she hadn't known, what nobody had bothered to tell her, was that Harlan Voss had been quietly buying up every deed he could get his hands on for the past 4 years. He'd started at the edges of town and worked his way in, using a company called Meridian Land Trust that most people hadn't heard of until their neighbors started selling, and then, somehow, regretting it. Nettie found out the way most people found out about things in Solace Creek, through Bess Thornley, who ran the dry goods store and knew everything. "He's got offers out on the Ames place, the old Dutton farm, and 3 parcels along the creek road," Bess told her one Tuesday morning, wrapping a spool of thread in brown paper. "Word is Meridian's got a buyer for the whole corridor, railroad maybe, or a cattle company from back east." Nettie didn't say anything right away. She stood there with the thread in her hand and thought about her father's maps, about the way he used to trace the creek road with one finger, saying, "Nettie, land doesn't lie, men do. But the land always tells the truth." "Who's Meridian?" she asked. Bess gave her a look. "That's the right question, isn't it?" Boyd McCready had come to Solace Creek 3 years ago from a county up north that Nettie had never visited. He was tall, dark-haired, with a scar along his left jaw from something he didn't talk about and a habit of arriving places earlier than anyone expected him. He was good at his job in the quiet way that meant crime was low and people mostly forgot he existed until they needed him. Nettie had noticed him the way you notice the weather, present, reliable, occasionally surprising. He'd noticed her the way a man notices a woman who doesn't seem to notice him back, which meant he noticed her quite a lot. The first time they'd spoken more than pleasantries was 2 months before the council meeting, when a fence post on the east boundary of her property had been pulled up and moved 16 feet into what was legally her pasture. She'd gone to the land office to check the records. The clerk had been strangely unhelpful. She'd gone to Boyd. He'd ridden out with her that same afternoon. He'd walked the boundary line without speaking for a long time, reading the land the way her father used to read maps. "That post's been moved," he said finally. "Recent. See the soil here. It's still loose." "I know it's been moved," Nettie said. "I need to know if there's a record of it. There shouldn't be. Your deed's clear." He looked at her. "You've read it?" "My father surveyed this land himself," she said. "I know every foot of it." He nodded. Not the kind of nod that means, "Sure, whatever you say." The kind that means I believe you, and I'm filing that away. She hadn't expected that. Most men in Solace Creek heard a woman make a factual claim about property and treated it like an opinion she'd formed from feeling. Boyd heard it and wrote it down in the small leather notebook he kept in his breast pocket. She'd driven home thinking about that. The council meeting had been called to discuss water rights along the Callaway River, a topic that sounded technical and dry, until you understood that whoever controlled the water controlled which farms survived the dry season and which ones didn't. Nettie had been invited because her property sat at the bend in the river where the main irrigation channel branched off, a fact that made her acreage more significant than its size suggested. Harlan Voss had not expected her to be there. That much was clear from the color that rose in his neck when he walked in. Harlan was 61 years old and had been the most powerful man in Solace Creek for so long that he'd forgotten there were rules about how power was supposed to work. He owned the feed mill, the main livery, and a substantial portion of the commercial district. He dressed well, spoke loudly, and donated to the church at Christmas in a way that ensured everyone knew exactly how much he'd donated. He was not accustomed to being looked at the way Nettie Caldwell looked at him. After the washwoman comment settled and the room found its new silence, the council meeting proceeded. Nettie had prepared. She'd spent 3 evenings with the county water rights ledger, borrowed, legally, from the recorder's office, and she'd found something in those pages that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Meridian Land Trust had filed a water use application 6 months ago for a volume of water that would, if approved, reduce flow to every downstream property on the eastern branch by nearly a third. The application was buried in a stack of routine filings. It hadn't been posted for public comment the way the law required. She waited until the meeting came to the agenda item on water allocation. Then she opened her folder. "I have a question about a filing," she said, "that I don't believe this council has seen." Harlan looked at her with the patient contempt of a man who has never been challenged by someone he's decided doesn't matter. "Mrs. Caldwell, water law is a complicated business. I understand water law," she said. "My father was a surveyor. I grew up reading easement documents." She slid the paper to the center of the table. "This application was filed by Meridian Land Trust in March. It was never publicly noticed. I'd like to know why." The silence this time was different. It had weight to it. The council chairman, a weathered man named Douglas Fitch, who had always struck Nettie as essentially honest, picked up the paper. His expression changed as he read it. Not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes that told her he was understanding something he hadn't understood before. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "The recorder's office," she said. "It's a public document. Anyone could have requested it." Douglas looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at the table. "I'd like to take a recess," Harlan said. "I'd like to continue the meeting," Nettie said. Boyd, who had been standing near the door, didn't move, but he was watching. "The recess happened anyway," Douglas insisted, with the weary diplomacy of a man trying to keep a situation from becoming a fire. During it, Nettie stood outside on the board sidewalk and let the evening air cool the heat in her face. She'd known coming in that this would make Harlan her enemy. She'd known it and come anyway. Because her father's maps were in her satchel, and the creek that ran along the east edge of her property was what kept her garden alive, and her 40 acres worth anything, and she was not going to sit quietly while someone buried a document in a filing stack and took it from her. Boyd came out and stood beside her. Not close, just beside her. "You prepared for tonight," he said. "I've been preparing for 3 weeks," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The sound of men talking inside filtered through the door, low and urgent. "Harlan's going to say the filing was a clerical error," Boyd said. "I know. He's going to say Meridian is just consolidating land for agricultural efficiency. I know that too. What are you going to say?" She looked at him. "I'm going to say that the ditch rider's log shows Meridian's crews testing the diversion channel in January, 2 months before the application was even filed, which means they were already diverting before they had legal permission." She paused. "I'm going to say that 3 of my neighbors have already signed over grazing rights to Meridian without knowing they included water access, because the contracts used language their lawyers, if they'd had lawyers, would have caught." Boyd looked at her for a long moment. "You have the ditch rider's log. I asked him for it. He gave it to me. He's been waiting for someone to ask." Boyd was quiet again. Then he said, "When this is over, I'm going to need a copy of everything you've got." "I made 2, she said. "One for you. One for the State Land Commissioner's office. I mailed the second one yesterday." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something between respect and the specific kind of surprise a person feels when they realize someone has thought further ahead than they did. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "Nettie," she said. "Please, Nettie." He said it once, like he was putting it somewhere he'd be able to find it later. "You should have been a lawyer." "My father said the same thing," she said, and went back inside. The second half of the council meeting was not what Harlan Voss had planned. When Douglas Fitch read the ditch rider's log aloud, the room's temperature changed. 3 of the councilmen Nettie had marked as Harlan's reliable votes shifted in their seats. Walt Briggs, who owned the hardware store and had always smiled at Harlan the way people smile at men they owe money to, stopped smiling. Harlan tried 3 different explanations, each smoother than the last. He said the diversion testing was standard infrastructure survey. He said the water application had been filed on advice of legal counsel, and any procedural irregularities were inadvertent. He said Meridian's interest in the river corridor was about conservation, not control. Each time he finished, Douglas would look at Nettie. Each time Nettie would set another document on the table. She had the survey logs from January. She had the lease agreements her neighbors had signed, with the buried water access clauses marked in red. She had a letter from the state engineer's office, dated 2 years ago, warning that the Callaway's eastern branch couldn't sustain a major diversion without damaging downstream agricultural users, a letter that Harlan, who sat on the county water board at the time, would have seen. That last document was the one that broke something open in the room. "You were on the water board," Douglas said to Harlan. His voice was very even. "You would have received this correspondence." "I receive a great deal of correspondence." "You signed the acknowledgement," Nettie said. She put the copy on the table. His signature was at the bottom, dated. The room was perfectly still. Harlan looked at her then with something that had stopped being contempt. It was harder than contempt, colder. She held his gaze and didn't look away. Not because she was unafraid. She was, a little, in the way you're afraid of standing at the edge of something very high. But because she'd learned from her father that looking away first was a kind of concession. And she had nothing to concede. "This meeting is adjourned," Douglas said. "Sheriff, I'd like a word." The weeks that followed were not comfortable ones. Harlan Voss was not a man who accepted the loss of control quietly. His son-in-law, a lawyer named Curtis, who practiced out of the county seat, came to town and made several visits to the recorder's office. A story circulated that Nettie had been spreading false information about local businesses. Someone moved one of her fence posts again. Boyd filed a report on the fence post within 24 hours. He did it personally, not through a deputy, which meant he rode out to her property on a Wednesday morning and spent an hour walking her boundary line with a measuring tape and a surveyor's pin she recognized from her father's toolbox. "You had this," she said. "Found it in the office supply cabinet. Your father donated a lot of things to the county over the years." He drove the pin into the correct position with a small mallet. "This is the corner. Anyone moves it again, it's criminal tampering." "It was criminal tampering the first time," she said. "Now I have it documented twice." He looked up from the pin. "How are you doing?" "Really?" The question surprised her. Men in her experience asked "how are you" the way they asked about the weather, expecting fine as the reply, not an actual answer. "I'm tired," she said, honestly. "I keep finding things I didn't know to look for. Every time I think I've mapped the whole thing, there's another layer." He sat back on his heels. "What did you find?" she told him. About the 3 families who'd been slowly pressured into selling, a story she'd pieced together from conversations at the dry goods store, at church, at the schoolyard fence, where she sometimes talked with women whose children she'd made clothes for, about the pattern she'd seen in the sell dates. They clustered around hardship years, late frost, a cattle sickness, a bad harvest. Meridian's offers came right after, when families were vulnerable. About the fact that when you laid her father's original survey maps over the current Meridian land holdings, you could see what Harlan was building. A corridor of land that ran from the ridge to the creek, a belt across the valley's most productive water access parcels, with her 40 acres sitting exactly in the middle of it, like the keystone in an arch. He listened without interrupting. She'd never talked this much to him before. She'd never talked this much to anyone about this. It came out of her in a steady, quiet flow, the way water moves when it's finally found the channel it's been looking for. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your 40 acres is what makes the whole corridor work," he said. "Yes, he needs your land. He needs my water access, which is attached to my land." She looked at him. He can't build what he's trying to build without routing through my property or spending 3 times as much to divert further up the ridge. So everything you've done at that council meeting made selling to him considerably less attractive, she said. If the state investigates the filing irregularities, Meridian's water application is void. The whole corridor becomes much harder to assemble legally, which means my land is worth less to him if he can't operate the water rights cleanly. Boyd looked at her for a long moment. You didn't just go to that meeting to protect your neighbors. I went to protect my neighbors, she said. And myself. Those things aren't separate. He nodded. Then slowly he smiled. A real one, not the polite professional kind she'd seen at town functions. It changed his face considerably. Your father taught you well, he said. My father taught me everything, she said. I just didn't know how much I'd need it. The state land commissioner's office sent an investigator to Solace Creek in early October. Her name was Ada Vickers, and she was 45 years old and wore the expression of a woman who had seen every variety of land fraud that creative men could devise, and was no longer surprised by any of them. She set up at the recorder's office for a week, requested every Meridian-related filing from the past 6 years, and interviewed 19 people. Nettie spent 3 hours with her on a Thursday afternoon, spreading her father's maps across the kitchen table and walking Ada through everything she'd found, in the order she'd found it, with the documents in a folder organized by date. Ada looked at the maps. She looked at the ditch rider's log. She looked at the signed acknowledgement from the state engineer's letter. How long did it take you to put this together, she asked. 7 weeks, Nettie said. Evenings, mostly. Ada looked at her over her reading glasses. You have any interest in working for this office? Nettie blinked. Excuse me? I'm not joking. We're chronically short of people who can read a survey map and construct a legal argument at the same time. Ada set down the folder. Think about it. The investigation concluded in December. Meridian Land Trust's water application was voided for failure to follow public notice requirements. Curtis, Harlan's son-in-law lawyer, negotiated a settlement on behalf of Meridian that included returning to their original owners the grazing rights that had been obtained through the contracts with buried clauses, on the condition that no criminal charges were filed. Harlan Voss did not attend the council meeting where these results were announced. He sent Curtis, who read a prepared statement about good faith efforts and inadvertent procedural errors. Nobody in the room looked particularly convinced, but Douglas Fitch accepted the statement and moved on, which was the kind of quiet justice that small towns sometimes manage when they've decided to resolve things without a war. The families who'd lost grazing rights got them back. 3 of them came to Nettie's house that week with casseroles and one notable pecan pie from Bess Thornley, who also brought the information that Harlan had quietly listed his interest in the feed mill for sale, and was rumored to be spending more time at his house in the county seat. Nettie put the casseroles in her kitchen and sat with the pecan pie for a moment by herself before cutting it. Her father's maps were spread across the table. She'd been looking at them again, not for evidence this time, just looking. Remembering him crouched over them with a lamp and a compass, his finger tracing the creek road, telling her that land doesn't lie. He'd been right. Boyd came by on a Saturday evening in late December, when the light was going early, and there was ice at the edges of the creek. He knocked at the door, which he'd never done before. He'd always come on official business through the back porch. Nettie noticed this and said nothing about it. She offered him coffee. He took it. He sat at her kitchen table where her father's maps still lay, and looked at them for a long moment without speaking. These are good surveys, he said. He was good at what he did. So are you. She poured her own coffee and sat down across from him. Outside, the creek made its particular winter sound. Slower than summer, more deliberate, water finding its way around ice. Ada Vickers sent me a letter, she said. She made the offer formal. A position with the land commissioner's office. I'd have to go to the county seat 3 days a week. He looked up from the maps. I haven't decided, she said. I'd need to hire someone to manage the east pasture. It's more complicated than staying, but... She looked at him. But my father spent 20 years measuring other people's land and making sure the lines were where they were supposed to be. I spent 7 weeks doing the same thing. I was good at it. She paused. I'd like to keep doing it. He was quiet. Then, the east pasture's not complicated. I know 2 men who'd lease it fair. She held her coffee cup in both hands. That's practical advice for a decision that isn't made yet. I give practical advice, he said, when I have it. She looked at him across the table, at the maps between them, at the coffee cooling in both their cups, at the last of the winter light coming through the window and catching the gray at his temples, which she hadn't noticed before. Boyd, she said. Nettie. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. They didn't need to. Some conversations don't require sentences so much as the willingness to sit still inside them together, and both of them had spent enough of their lives measuring things precisely to know when the lines were clear. I'm going to take the position, she said. I know, he said. I figured you would. The East Pasture tenants, she said. You'll introduce me? Monday, if you want Monday, she said. The creek ran under the ice outside. The coffee stayed warm a little longer than it should have, in the way that things do when no one is in a hurry to leave. Her father's maps lay between them on the table, every line of them precise, the creek road traced in his hand, all 40 acres of it exactly as he'd measured it, hers recorded true. She left them there.